dad was a dry drunk and my mom was so passive, and they were both brought up in residential school, they couldn't teach us anything cultural or to be encouraged about anything. That didn't happen. They never even hugged us. They couldn't. They didn't know how. So I gave up my kids to child welfare because I felt so inadequate. I felt like I was not doing a good job. And so I thought child welfare would do a better job than me.
When I was living in Saskatchewan, I was just a little baby at the time. I was with an uncle and his girlfriend at the time, and I lived with them since I was born, and I guess I went through a lot of abusive stuff with them. I've only heard stories, but my grandma knew what was going on, so she got my auntie to come get me and ended up taking care of me from 2 years old till I was about 12. And she passed away around that time, so my aunt was the last house I lived at before I got apprehended, and I was put into a detention center. After I got out of the detention center, YYC, I was put into a ward of the government. I AWOL'd from every single group home they ever put me in. I didn't care. I thought, oh, it's pretty laid back. I could do whatever I want. That's what I thought. And I just bounced around from group home to group home, no stability. And the social worker got sick of it, and she actually found me a foster home an hour out of Edmonton.
I mean, the purpose of colonization is to create a vulnerable group. And I think that it was very successful because it left us really vulnerable to government whims. So going back then to the treaties and the reserves, the establishment of the reserves, we made agreements to, yeah, we will sign over these massive tracts of land in exchange for certain rights and benefits in perpetuity, right? So forever. And yet we know that those rights have been whittled away.
Within 3 weeks, I started phoning the department to try and get my kids back. And you know what? I couldn't. And but when my little baby came home, and he was always smiley baby, always laughing and smiling when he was little. And when he came home, he was just spaced out, and he had he didn't smell very good. He was dirty. And the child welfare worker had medicine on one hand, antibiotic, I guess, and she had the baby in one hand, and she said, "Here," and she gives me the medicine. And then I took a scissors, it was shrunken sweater, and she stood there and she said, "Well, don't do that, you know." And so I got really mad at her. I put the scissors down and I said, "You get the fuck out of my house right now."
In the mid-60s, I think it was about 1967, and we see the young white social workers starting to move into the reserves.
Misconception that they have about Aboriginal people, and also not understanding how some Aboriginal people live.
And my experience and interest in child welfare go back to when I was a social worker in the 60s, when people were being scooped. There were so many stories there that my colleagues really had very little idea about, and actually became saddened, outraged, angry, every emotion you could find, ashamed, all these things that came to mind when I realized that what had actually happened. There was an undertone when I look back on it that was essentially racist. The perspectives that had been described by the people who ran residential schools or who created residential schools didn't go away. We became, I think, a lot more subtle or careful about how we termed things, but I think the underlying feelings or attitudes were still much the same.
I kind of lost touch with my family, my brothers and sisters, but when they got taken away from my mom, I don't know, we didn't really have a relationship anymore. I guess in 2005 and 6, me and my brother were starting to build a relationship again. He liked rapping, emceeing, so I promised him that when he turned 18, I'd take him to all the hip-hop shows and b-boy battles and everything. That was going to be like our time together. As soon as that started happening, he ended up in a hospital, mental health section, and then they sent him to Alberta Hospital after that. I guess it's because the group home couldn't handle him or something. They said he had behavioral problems, but that was only because of like whatever my brother was been through, you know? He had a lot of anger inside him. He didn't know how to deal with it. I was actually getting ready to go to Italy to go dance at a festival. And then the next day I got a phone call from Alberta Hospital saying that he ran away. And I was just hoping he'd come to my house, but he never showed up, and days went by and no answer, and they still didn't know where he was, so I just assumed he was at a friend's house. And then finally, Saturday, I left to Italy, and then 5 days later I got a message in the email saying to contact the government. And then I called, and the social workers of his told me I better sit down, and they told me what happened to him, that they found him on the CN railroad tracks here in Edmonton. And I was just shocked, and I just broke down after that. I didn't know what to do, so they paid for a ticket for me to come back to Edmonton for his funeral, which is messed up because I always ask them for a driver, because I know I've been in foster homes. I know that you can get a driver to go visit your family, and they would say, we're not going to pay for a driver to go for you to visit your brother. But they told me they'd pay for a freaking $2,000 plane ticket for his funeral, you know? It's so messed up. He passed away 2 weeks before he was turning 18, and I was just I was so depressed. I didn't want to go to any more shows, and I was going to quit dancing.
One weekend, I just left my kids with a friend, and I kept on drinking and drinking. And once in a while, I would think I got to go pick up my kids. But I was going through so much stress from, my marriage wasn't working or anything. And so I decided not to. I'll go and get them Sunday. And when I did, they told me they were in child welfare.
The system has been structured so that we not only are lacking power, but so that then we feel powerless.
I felt so intimidated by the court, by child welfare and everything. I felt and I started crying when they were talking to me, when I didn't understand what it was they were trying to say to me, because to me it was like foreign language, they were asking for, I guess, temporary guardianship. I didn't know nothing about things like that, I just stood there, and then in the end, they were going to keep my kids. That's all I understood. And then I just walked out of court, and I was crying. And then I just walked into York Hotel and got drunk and stayed drunk for the rest of the month. Every time I sobered up, or waking up from, the first thing that was in my head were my kids. And I didn't know where they were. And that is worse, I think, sometimes than if they would have died, because at least there's a finality or whatever. But it was like they had died. When we study our history, we begin to understand why it is we have the difficulties we have in our communities, eh? The more I did that, the more I began to understand my life. The more I began to understand my mom and dad's life as children, and my grandparents. And the more I understood also, the more I began to realize it wasn't because I was bad. It was because I didn't have an opportunity to be strong like the roots of an oak tree, because my traditions and my values and my spirituality was not there. And it isn't the fault of my mom and dad. they didn't have an opportunity.